the potluck, whatever, however they say it, that ceremony was banned. People weren't allowed to dance. If you were status Indian, you weren't allowed to vote in federal elections. You had to give up your Indian status. Additionally, in that era prior to 1969, the government also put in laws through the Indian Act, from my understanding, that said that indigenous tribes reserves, they can't hire a lawyer to represent them for their legal land cases. So they basically said that you can't defend yourselves in the court system. Okay, and this went on for a few generations, like 75 years from what I recall previously learning. Which means that the people who it initially happened to were long dead by the time the people who raised the concern, raised the issue in court, right? And there were some laws that changed and some legal processes that occurred here that allowed the Nisga'a people to actually go to a court and make a claim against the Canadian government. And they actually ended up winning. So the Supreme Court in 1973 ruled that the Nisga'a had a pre-existing title to the land due to their long-time occupation, possession, and use of it. In one of my other courses, I have notes on, like a lot more in-depth notes on this case. But unfortunately, I don't have them here. Here's a quote. It says, "The fact is that when the settlers came, the Indians were there, organized in societies and occupying the land as their forefathers had done for centuries. This is what the Indian title means." So that might have been what the court stated, like their final statement on the issue, acknowledging that these people have existed here for thousands of years, and so that land is theirs. So this is more of a case study. It's important to examine what happened in Canada, but I do think it's also additionally important to examine what happened in other places, and particularly, I'd say, what the British Empire is doing as well. Another question. So the Hudson's Bay is a company that operates in Canada. Their primary thing is furs, but the British and Dutch and various other European nations are also expanding around the world in other areas. So between this time, 1492, and let's say the year 2000, or this time of Age of Imperialism for Europe, they also conducted this mercantilist imperial activity in Africa as well. So they split up Africa. The British went into India as well. I was actually listening to a podcast on this. Kind of interesting that the interviewer asked, how did the British come to rule in India? And the person who was responding was stating that at the time, these two leaders, I believe they were brothers, they had a conflict with one another. And one person asked the British military to come in and help him deal with this problem with this other brother. And that is what led to the military takeover or just the influence of England in India. Prior to British rule was Mughal rule, Mughal Empire. If I recall correctly, that they're Muslim, they're Islamic. Anyways, the British East India Company plays a big role in what is going on in India. They start as an association of traders. Eventually, they amass enough influence. They have political influence as well and power in this area of the world. They can make decisions. They can make life easier or more difficult for various people living in India. With them, they also bring their own system of organization, right? And they may have capitalized on systems that already existed. So how many of you know about the caste system in India? Has anyone heard of this? Caste or caste? Anyone? Okay, so the caste system in India, so in India they have a hierarchical society. Sometimes it's based on last names, like certain people are higher up and lower up. Has anyone here heard of the untouchables in India? So the lowest class of people in India, they're called untouchables. Say that again. They're called the untouchables, and with their belief system of karma, it's believed that these people are reincarnated into this life. They had done something previously in their previous lives that was bad, so they're born into this untouchables class. And what that means is that you're not allowed to touch them and associate with them. Right? They can only deal with one another. I'd recently learned as well in these systems that it's believed, and again, I could be wrong, I would need to verify this, but I had a conversation about this, that let's say you want to do something charitable, help out somebody who's in poverty, they're part of this untouchable class. From my understanding, there's a mindset that helping them is actually prolonging their suffering. Like the reason they're in that position is because they did something in a past life. Okay? So it's entirely possible that the British came in, like many European countries did, like many rulers do, to be quite frank, and they just looked at whatever system was in place and said, okay, well, how can we utilize this to our benefit? You know, it's entirely possible they did that as well as applying their own kind of European democratic, or whatever system they were using, European way of life on this group of people. Okay. Within the Indian dilemma, let's say, of imperialism under the British, you know, Mahatma Gandhi rises up as someone who opposes this British government, or this imperial government as well. You know, and so again, his whole point here is that, you know, the British have their way of doing things and the Indians have their way of doing things, and claiming that it's not right for the British to, you know, transfer their form of civilization on another group of people. It doesn't relate to the history and culture and traditions of that land. Gandhi believed that their Indian civilization was superior and that the British should remove their schools and courts and reestablish the Indian schools and courts. He believed that the British should learn Hindi and engage the Indian population in their language and customs. So people will differ on this topic of, you know, how beneficial was the British rule in India for Indians. Some people would be more in support of it because maybe it brought more law and order into their society. Some people would be against it because maybe they, you know, went against their traditions and customs. You have notes for this? So as mentioned again, so 1876, so you know, there's North America that's being, we'll just say imperialized. There's South America as well. There's Africa, and there's, you know, parts of Asia as well. So in Africa, King Leopold II of Belgium, you know, he played a big role in the colonial exploration of Africa. I have better slides for this somewhere else, but I just don't know where, unfortunately. Okay. Anyways, the gist of it is that many of these European nations simply decided that wherever we go, how can we capitalize, how can we benefit financially, economically from what is available in those regions. I think our next slide goes into more detail about specific events. I will give you a moment to fill in your notes. So I will address, you know, just the relevance of this information. We can have a conversation on that once we're done, because it is a lot of information. It's a lot of historical information, which some people might find it very hard to relate to or understand why we're discussing this. But you know, we'll discuss that shortly. Does anyone else still taking notes? One note I could say on this is that, you know, obviously we're seeing how Belgium, France, Portugal, how these various European powers are, you know, more or less having these proxy conflicts in other areas. So rather than fight each other directly, they're fighting for control and claim of different territories around the world to gain, again, whatever economic benefit they can that will then help them in whatever conflicts they have with European people or to benefit themselves. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Ooh, look at this nice little drawing. So the Berlin Conference is the conference essentially that, as you can see here, well, first of all, how would you describe the people who are sitting at this table? Again, you can be honest and brutal. They look like politicians. They're all what? They all look old. They're all men.
They look kind of rich.
They look rich. They're, someone said it here. They're white. Okay. All accurate descriptions of what you're seeing here. They look like they're conducting business, figuring out, how do we get our next paycheck. Do you think at this table they ever discussed the impact of what they were about to do on the people they're about to do it against? You're shaking your heads no. Is that something they should have done? And why do we think that? I'm curious.
Politicians have a responsibility to think about everyone you're representing and how it affects people.
So being responsible to the people you're representing, do you think